coming now is wow, 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 wow. Welcome to the working week. Oh, I know it don't thrill you.
Welcome back to Morning Joe. Steve Ratner is still with us, and joining the set, Republican Senator from Pennsylvania, Senator Pat Toomey, and CEO of the Comeback America Initiative, former comptroller to the U.S., David Walker, and still with us in Washington, taking his lumps this morning, Michael Steele. Thank you, Michael. Joe is off today. We look forward to having him back later in the week. I'll do my best to hold down the fort here. We'll start with Greece. I want you to set the scene with me, Steve, and then we'll take it to the panel. President Obama touched down in Mexico last night for the start of the G20 summit, where he's expected to urge European leaders to focus on pro-growth policies before austerity. Now, this comes as stocks in Europe opened strong on the news that Greece's pro-bailout party claimed victory in this weekend's parliamentary elections. European Union leaders are breathing a collective sigh of relief as the conservative New Democracy Party took a narrow victory over the anti-austerity left, meaning Greece will remain a member of the Union, at least for the time being. Republican presidential nominee Mitt Romney reacted to the Greek election and European financial crisis, saying no matter what happens in the Eurozone under a Romney presidency, Europe will never get a U.S.-backed bailout.
We're not going to send checks to Europe. We're not going to bail out the European banks. We're going to be poised here to support our economy, but I'm very much in favor of the fundamental things one does to strengthen the economic footings of a nation. I certainly don't believe that we should expose our national balance sheet to the vagaries of what's going to be happening in Europe. Europe is capable of dealing with their banking crisis if they choose to do so.
Mitt Romney very clear in his position there, but Steve Ratner set the scene for us in Greece. Crisis averted, but?
Greece avoided going over the cliff. If the election had gone the other way, then it would have been a disaster. But this is only a temporary reprieve. They still face enormous, enormous challenges in trying to get their budget and their austerity program and their whole way their economy functions in line with the Eurozone. The problem with the Eurozone, as we've talked about before, is you've got 17 countries tied together with one currency, which means they all have to march at the same speed forward. And Greece has not been able to march at the same speed forward. They have bloated labor costs. They have an inefficient government system. They don't collect taxes. It is a country that simply does not operate in any way that's similar to the countries like Germany and France and Belgium and the Netherlands that are the leaders of the Eurozone. And so it is crisis averted for today, but in that G20 meeting in Mexico, there's going to be a lot of discussion. There's a European summit meeting at the end of June. This is going to continue. This saga is not going to end for a long time.
And this will demand a lot of the president's time. He's got a lot of different issues around the world that are simmering at the same time. Senator Toomey, how does Greece impact the United States, and also what you were trying to do in Washington and the economic problems that we are facing here?
I think the important thing is to make sure that our financial institutions, that our financial system minimizes the exposure to a meltdown in Europe. Frankly, I don't see how it's at all possible for Greece to stay in the euro. I think the euro was an impossible idea, and that's playing out right now for the reasons that Steve alluded to. Greece has a 25% higher per unit labor cost than Germany. It simply can't compete, and that makes this an unsustainable arrangement. The last thing we ought to do is put U.S. taxpayer resources into propping up something that is guaranteed to fail, just a question of when. What they need to do is make their economy more competitive. The Greek political system has not demonstrated the will to do that, so they've bought a little time. The best thing they could do with this time that they've bought, seems to me, is to plan an orderly change in the euro, an orderly recomposition, because there's several countries that can't stay.
Some sort of transition. Dave Walker, would you agree with that? And the EU's woes, can they be fixed through austerity alone?
No, they can't. I mean, we're in the middle innings with regard to Greece, and quite frankly, Greece isn't the only country that has challenges in Europe. The truth is there's a difference between maximizing the common market, which is in the interest of Europe, and maximizing the Eurozone. The Eurozone needs to be rationalized. It needs to be somewhat smaller. It needs to have a lot tougher fiscal policy and more enforceable fiscal policies, and hopefully the Europeans will recognize that reality. But, frankly, a lot of Americans might say, why should they care? Well, the reason they should care is because we have an interconnected and interdependent economy. Financial markets will be affected. The European economy, if it's weak, it's going to affect us. We have a temporary reprieve right now on our interest costs because of the uncertainty in Europe. But frankly, the other reason they ought to care is when you look at our comparable numbers, 134% of debt to GDP based upon comparable numbers, which is less than 2 years away from Greece when Greece had its initial problems.
Michael Steele, you heard Mitt Romney talking about never bailing out Europe in any way. How does this play politically, if it does at all, given the fact that people are pretty focused inward here in the United States on jobs in the race for the White House?
Well, I think it plays very well simply because it's a consistent message that Mitt Romney has had from the very beginning about spending, about the creation of debt and the weight of debt on the back of the American taxpayer. So you heard him say several times, you know, I'm not looking to bail out Europe. As a president, we're not going to put in policies that would require our banking system to underwrite or somehow support their banking system. So I think that that's a very important message for the American people to hear, that we are focused, as you said, Mika, closer to home in our own bank accounts, our own worries, and knowing that at least Mitt Romney, and maybe President Obama to some extent, but certainly Mitt Romney is very clear and adamant about making sure that there's a bright line between where the water's edge is from what we are able to do and will do with the European crisis unfolding the way it is. They don't have the same banking system we have, and I think the point that was just made is a correct one about how, you know, this system is a failed system from the beginning, because all they did was say, oh, we're all kind of working together financially now, let's pool our money, without the fundamental underlying financial structure to support the weight of disparages between the cost and the benefit analysis that's required to be successful. And the reality is coming home to roost right now.
There's a Fed meeting this week. We're going to get to that with Steve Ratner in just a moment. But let's go to Los Cabos, Mexico. NBC News chief White House correspondent and political director and host of the Daily Rundown, Chuck Todd, is standing by there where the G20 summit is going to be taking place. I can't imagine, Chuck, they won't be talking about what happened in Greece.
No, it's going to be a big part of this meeting. I mean, they knew this going in. White House officials knew how big you had the Greek vote, and essentially, until they knew the results of that, you didn't really have an idea of what this G20 would be. This would be a much different G20 had the Greek vote gone the wrong way, and then you'd have had a little more panic, a little more of these leaders having to figure out where to go next, where to do here, how to see if there's any sort of international solution to helping the Europeans. So there certainly is sort of a sense of relief here, certainly among the Americans, but among everybody, that, okay, at least now there's a way forward. Merkel just landed, the German chancellor. The president's going to have added a one-on-one with her to try to deal with this. But don't forget, the other big issue out of here is going to be Syria. The president has his first one-on-one with Putin since Putin moved from being prime minister to president. And that actually happens before the G20 starts. So the first piece of big news out of here may be on Syria, not the world economy.
Dave Walker?
Chuck, obviously they're going to be talking about Greece, but in the backdrop of all of this, you know, we've got our own problems here. I mean, to what extent are you hearing people talking about the fact, well, who's the United States to be able to tell Europe what to do when we haven't begun to take steps to put our own financial house in order? And when you look at some comparable numbers, frankly, our numbers are pretty ugly.
Well, they are, except there are some, the U.S. feels that given the growth numbers of Europe versus the growth numbers of the United States, that actually what the United States did 3 years ago in dealing with their initial financial crisis, their banking crisis, that now looking backwards, it looks a heck of a lot more like a potential way to path forward for the Europeans as opposed to what they had been doing. So that is how the U.S. plays is sort of an advisory role here, saying, look, this is what worked for capitalizing our banks. This is what worked. So when you talk about the different pieces of advice that that the role the United States is playing here, they say, hey, look at what the United States did in 2009. And as unpopular as some of those things were, when you consider the state of our economy versus Europe's, it actually does look like something that might be worth borrowing from.
Wow. Okay, Chuck Todd, live from Los Cabos, Mexico. Thanks very much. As I mentioned, the Fed's Open Market Committee kicks off a big meeting tomorrow where it will consider whether to provide further monetary easing in the wake of the poor jobs number. Steve Ratner, you have more charts.
More charts.
You came equipped this morning.
I came equipped this morning.
That's good, because I think people would be really interested in being able to follow what is going down at this Fed meeting and what it'll mean to them, given those jobs numbers.
So the issue in front of the Fed is the jobs numbers and what to do about it and whether to engage in another form of easing. You'll remember that interest rates are already almost zero for short-term borrowing. They're somewhat higher but low for long-term borrowing. And the question for the Fed is, do they continue buying bonds in order to keep interest rates low? So let me just give you a little bit of background using a couple of charts. The first one takes a look at our deficit. Obviously, each year when we run a deficit, we then have to go out and borrow money to fund that deficit. Back in the 05, 06, 07 period, our deficits were relatively low. They were funded heavily by foreign borrowings, although they now look small in retrospect, but they were a large percentage back then. Fed wasn't terribly active. Private sector, meaning Americans, weren't terribly active. And then in 08, the deficits exploded, and so they had to be funded. And initially, the private sector, which is the green bars, the red, which is the foreign buyers, continued to step up their purchases, and the Fed was more active but not that active. But when you get to 2011, an interesting thing happens. The private sector steps back. I think there was a conventional feeling that interest rates were so low here that it was just not an attractive investment. The foreign sector steps back, perhaps for the same reason, perhaps for other agendas, and the Fed steps up and was literally buying 60% of the treasuries that were issued last year. What this is, in effect, is the Fed printing money to buy our bonds. And this is a very controversial subject, and I suspect Senator Toomey may have a thing or two to say about this, and Dave Walker, but let me just lay out the facts. But what the Fed is trying to do is keep long-term interest rates low to stimulate the economy. Now, you can see the trend here in the 10-year Treasury, and if we went back further, it would have been even higher. But you've had this dramatic drop in the 10-year Treasury rate all the way down to about 1.6%, a record low. And what's unusual about this is normally in a recovery, interest rates start to go up. But because this economic recovery has been so weak, the Fed has been trying to push interest rates down and has been quite successful at doing it. Now, a lot of people worry about the consequences for inflation, because the flip side of printing too much money is inflation. The Fed watches this very closely, as we all do. And one way to look at it is what's called inflation expectations, or what do people expect inflation to be? What does the market expect inflation to be? So you see, back in the 2008 period during our meltdown, we were actually worried about deflation. We were about the economy collapsing, worried about prices collapsing. That would obviously be a bad thing. The Fed stepped into action, and it began buying debt to bring interest rates down. But as the economy recovered, and you can see here the 3 times that the Fed bought debt, each time it bought debt, inflationary expectations went up a bit because people expect a little more inflation.
Senator
But can I say one last thing? Senator Toomey has the floor. But the key part is that even after all of this, inflationary expectations have remained very stable, just above this 2% level, which is why the Fed may well take the view that it has the room to continue to buy large amounts of debt when it meets this week.
Wow.
This, in my view, this isn't just playing with fire. This is playing with explosives.
Why?
First of all, when a central bank monetizes a huge portion of its government debt, this is generally a recipe for disaster. Right now, we have $1.5 trillion of excess reserves from the banks sitting on deposit with the Federal Reserve. That starts working its way through the system, and the natural multiplier effect of a fractional reserve banking system. I think there's a huge risk of inflation. Finally, the Fed is a huge enabler here. Maintaining artificially low interest rates disguises the true cost of our deficits. And our debt is being funded at these ridiculously low rates because the Fed has engineered it that way. And frankly, it has relieved the pressure on politicians to fix what's broken, which is to get our fiscal house in order.
Dave Walker.
We are self-dealing in our own debt in order to try to stimulate the economy, keep mortgage rates down to help the housing market.
Well, doesn't the housing market need help?
It does need. That's short-term gain, but it's increased risk of long-term pain. You can't self-deal in your own debt forever. In addition, we're benefiting from the uncertainty in Europe. and therefore we are a temporary safe haven for investors. Ultimately, we're going to need to put our finances in order if we want to combat inflation over time, if we want to moderate interest rates over time. My personal view is we need some targeted investments in the short term, coupled with a real structural reform program at the same time. You need to do both in order to have a prudent path forward.
Steve.
I actually don't disagree with you guys, in part anyway. I think we have to get our fiscal house in order. I think we have to restructure how we spend our money and make it more productive. But our Congress is gridlocked. Nothing is happening.
Nothing.
Right now, the Fed,
Nothing.
let me finish. Right now, the Fed is the only game in town. And I think that what it's doing to try to keep our economy going is the right thing. I share your concern about inflation, Senator. And I'm counting on the Fed and Ben Bernanke, who I think is a fine individual, to find the moment when to start to move in the other direction and sell these bonds and let interest rates.
He's got to be looking at the
There's-
fact that nothing's being done in Congress.
There's an old saying that if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Well,
and the problem is our fundamental problems of our economy are not monetary in nature. And the Fed, of course, has this dual mandate, which I disagree. I think their only mandate should be price stability. And so, yeah, they're going to great lengths here, but I think it's very, very dangerous. We should be dealing with the underlying problem, getting our fiscal house in order, removing some of the excess regulatory burdens, and taking this massive tax increase off the table so our economy can grow.
I think Steve's exactly right that the Fed is the only game in town, that the executive and legislative branches aren't doing their job. But the other thing that's happening is that Congress changed the Fed's mandate in 1978 to require it to start focusing on short-term unemployment, which politicized the Fed. And so I do think the Fed's the only game in town. It needs to do what it can, but we can't continue to kick the can down the road with regard to the Congress and the President starting to make tough choices. And I have more confidence in the Fed's ability to change course than I do
Is there any way to break the cycle of getting nothing done until the election in Washington? It's not possible, is it? Can you tell me the Republicans will compromise
honestly,
on anything,
well,
the Democrats will compromise on anything?
You know, I understand the frustration, and you're completely right. We're not getting anything done as we should, but it's not quite fair to paint everyone with the same brush.
I'm not.
Republicans have introduced budgets. They have passed a budget in the House for 2 consecutive years. 4 Republican budgets were offered on the Senate side, 0 from the Democrats. And when the president's budget was put on the floor, he got 0 votes in both bodies because it's not a serious document. So I'm very frustrated. Hey, look, we've got a big farm bill. We're going to spend $1 trillion over the next 10 years, and Republicans are not even allowed to choose the amendments they want to offer. It's maddening, and it's dysfunctional.
If you look at the U.S. government, Mika, we've been a republic for 223 years, and we still don't have 3 things that it takes to maximize success and mitigate risk. 1, we have no plan. Number 2, we have no budget. And number 3, we don't have performance indicators to understand which government spending programs, tax policies, and regulatory actions are working and which ones aren't. We're 0 for 3. That's a strikeout. It's time that we address that.
Yeah, I mean, do you blame Pat Toomey, and get back to this point, hold your point, I'm sure you have one, for passing an executive order on immigration? What would he have gotten done in Congress?
The point,
nothing.
But Mika, here's the point.
But
the president, but the president disagrees with Congress about the right income tax rate. Does that give him the power and the authority to go out and just establish his own and start collecting a higher rate of income tax?
I think the point here is nothing would have gotten done, so he issued an executive order.
So we have a constitution that says that when the president wants to change the law, he needs to do it in cooperation with Congress. He can't just do it unilaterally. Well, that's if you have a Congress that's functioning. No, the Constitution doesn't say that if Congress is slow, he can do what he pleases.
I'm a little nervous. Go ahead.
My point is simply, Senator, that you paint a picture of a Congress that's sort of chugging along. The Republicans are doing their thing. They're passing bills.
They're really
that's
trying.
Not my picture. No, it's totally dysfunctional.
Well, I want totally dysfunctional, right?
That's right.
And the blame lies on both sides, and it lies in an unwillingness to compromise, in my opinion, and an unwillingness to compromise on things like taxes.
Do you think it matters at all that one party is putting out a budget proposal that in great detail lays out a 10-year plan to restore fiscal solvency, and the other party refuses to offer an idea? Does that not matter?
Well, I don't think that's exactly true.
Sure, it's true.
That's not exactly true.
Where is the Democrats' budget?
Has put out repeatedly.
And he got 0 votes from Democrats.
He puts out budgets
0.
every year. But the point is that there is no willingness on either side to meet in the middle. And we're not going to solve these problems unless we meet in the middle.
I really think we need to adopt what the No Labels organization is advocating, and I'm one of the national founders. No budget, no pay. If you don't have a budget passed and all the appropriations bills by the beginning of the fiscal year, Congress doesn't get paid until it does. It is fundamental. We can blame a lot of people.
Yeah.
We need a basic budget. We need the appropriations bills. That is the only thing in the Constitution.
Would that incentivize you,
Well, what more incentive am I supposed to have? I wrote a budget 2 years in a row. I introduced it on the Senate floor. I took a lot of arrows because it does some dramatic things that a lot of people disagree with. Totally entitled to their point of view on that. But I just don't think it's acceptable for the other side to have no idea, to put no budget on the table. Almost all the Republicans voted for my budget, and most Republicans voted for the Ryan budget. We've got different ideas about how we get to fiscal solvency. But it's just not acceptable to me for the other side to just throw rocks and have no plan of their own.
Would you have compromised on anything?
Absolutely. I took ideas from the president's budget.
Like what?
Like, for instance, the fact that I think upper-income senior citizens ought to pay more for their Medicare benefits. I think it's ridiculous that we subsidize Medicare to the extent we do for wealthy people.
But Senator, then why not just endorse Simpson-Bowles? It was a bipartisan agreement, including a number of Republican senators.
You may recall I was the guy on the super committee who put together a framework that was parallel and in many ways consistent with Simpson-Bowles. I got no cooperation from the other side.
Senator Pat Toomey, thank you very much. David Walker, thank you as well. Our